everyone, it's Mexi. Welcome to another video. So today we're going to dive into what was number 2 in our Twitter poll, the Global Reserve Army of Labor. I'd like to give a special shout out to Dr. Jamil, Jonna, Dr. John Bellamy Foster, and Dr. Robert McChesney for graciously supplying me with updated facts and just a wealth of insight on these topics. If you haven't checked out Monthly Review Press or MR Online, I'll link those in the description box below so you can check them out. So we've all seen the memes. Millennials are ruining every industry imaginable, and not buying a house, homeownership is a big pipe dream for most. If they could just restrain themselves and stop binging on Avo on toast, maybe they could set something up for themselves. Excuse me, but I have 3 degrees and I'm still working contract work for 12 grand a year, whereas you entered upper management with a high school diploma and bought a house for 200 grand, but that's a whole other video. So why is that? Why is it that despite all of the quote-unquote advancement and productivity since the 1970s, it's becoming increasingly difficult to get a well-paying, secure job with benefits, and an entire generation of kids are coming out of school today overeducated, burdened with debt, and facing an increasingly precarious job market, where there's nothing but low-skilled, low-wage, part-time contract work? The short answer to that is capitalism, the long explanatory answer to follow. So this is the part of the program where I plug basically all of my previous videos, but most of all the sweatshop video and the video on crisis, finance, and stagnation, because all of these topics really fit together. So previously we learned that competition under capitalism actually tends towards monopoly power, where the big fish eat the little fish and try to capture the biggest market share. One major way that corporations compete to increase their profit margins and increase their market share is by lowering the cost of production. This can be done by innovating new technology and automating things so that you actually just displace workers entirely or make them redundant. Or it could be by outsourcing your production to somewhere in the globe where people will do it much, much cheaper. Or through cutting costs environmentally, which, as we've also discussed, is just a fucking disaster. So in the sweatshop video, we learned that it was largely the deregulation of trade barriers through the neoliberal era, like the 70s and the 80s, that allowed for much of this offshoring to occur. This set up a situation where capital is free to move, but labor is not. And so workers anywhere in the world, in the quote-unquote developed world, in the quote-unquote developing world, I know these categories are not good, first world, third world, workers anywhere in the world, if they organized and they tried to demand better rates, better work conditions, better pay, guess what? Capital is free to move somewhere else where they can get the work done for cheaper and keep their profit margins rising. So labor here has very little leverage. And remember again that we talked about neoliberal policies being a fix for the crises of capitalism. So capitalism itself is once again the driving force behind all of these terrible things. So in my sweatshop video, I got several comments or several people asking me, don't you realize that these people need jobs? If Apple's sweatshops weren't there, then what would they be doing? They need and they want these sweatshop jobs. Like, these sweatshops are helping. So we're gonna take a look at the reasons why people are increasingly finding themselves in situations that are so precarious that they must accept shitty, low-pay work just to be able to feed themselves. One way that capitalism produces this vast, low-wage workforce is through big land grabs in the global south. Basically, big agribusiness conglomerates buy up huge swaths of land and then kick off the peasants or the smallholder farmers, who are then driven in droves into the urban slums, desperate for work. Once again, this is an example of primitive accumulation jargon. But basically, people get kicked off their land, they lose the means of production, they lose the means of subsistence and feeding themselves. And so, yes, they are desperate for whatever job they can take, but this is part and parcel of the spatialities of capitalism itself. So it becomes ridiculous to say that sweatshops are helping or sweatshops are the answer. So the depeasantization of all these people in the quote-unquote global south, combined with the integration of the workforce of all of the actually existing socialist countries, since the 1980s has led to a boom in the global workforce. And once again, most of this is low-skilled, low-wage work, where companies are going after the most easily exploitable populations like women and children because they know they can pay them the least. So why does this matter? Why does it matter that the pool of labor is growing bigger and bigger? And what does that tell us about the future of capitalism, or capitalism's ability to meet our needs as a system going forward? The answer is in the general law of capitalist accumulation. Shout out Marx. He developed this theory trying to figure out how capital accumulation could continue continuously at all. That is, why is it that an increase in productivity, an increase in a growth of demand for labor does not lead to wages rising indefinitely and squeezing accumulation? In other words, theoretically, if you have capital accumulation and increasing production, you would have an increased demand for labor, and so labor's power with respect to capital would theoretically increase. If there's a shortage of labor, then labor has much more bargaining power. Capitalists have to compete to get that labor, and so they would have to pay higher wages, pay benefits, etc. So why is it that this doesn't lead to a situation where wages rise indefinitely and just cut off accumulation altogether? The answer is that the growth of accumulation is able to proceed unhindered only if it also displaces and makes redundant large numbers of workers. As Foster and McChesney state, the resulting redundancy of workers checks any tendency toward a too rapid rise in real wages, which would bring accumulation to a halt. By constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, the capitalist system is able, no less constantly, to produce a relative surplus population or reserve army of labor, which competes for jobs with those in the active labor army. So capitalism as a system inherently produces great wealth, but also great poverty. It produces jobs, but only alongside great unemployment or precarious underemployment. So this chart demonstrates that from 1991 to 2015, the global reserve army of labor constituted about 60% of the available working population in the world. Marx broke the reserve army down into three categories: the floating population, the latent reserve army, and the stagnant population. The floating population consists of workers that are unemployed due to normal ups and downs of the accumulation cycle, or as a result of technological unemployment. The latent reserve army refers to all of those people working subsistence agriculture, as I talked about, who are constantly at risk of land grabs and depeasantization. And the stagnant population is part of the reserve army, but with extremely irregular employment. So this includes part-time and casual workers who desire full-time work, as well as people doing outsourced work for near slave wages, or people who make their living in the informal sector, the informal economy. But all of these populations are reflected here in the vulnerable, unemployed, and inactive categories. In 2015, according to stats from the International Labor Organization, the global reserve army consisted of more than 2.3 billion people, compared to around 1.66 billion in the active labor army. And many of these people in the active army are, of course, precariously employed. The number of officially unemployed, corresponding to Marx's floating population, is close to 200 million. 1.5 billion workers are classified as vulnerably employed, relating to Marx's stagnant population. And this is made up of workers working, quote unquote, on their own account, including subsistence farmers, informal workers in the informal economy, and domestic workers. 630 million people between the age of 25 and 54 are classified as economically inactive. According to Jonna and Foster, however, these statistics actually downplay the extent of the reserve army of labor. People who are listed as employed, it's not taken into consideration the increasing precariousness that a lot of people face in their jobs, or the fact that they may only have a very partial and insecure relation to employment. They said that the share of workers globally making $2 or less per day was about 25% in 2014. Precariousness is particularly high in the developing world, where the working poor making $4 or less per day make up more than half of all workers. Nearly 60% of wage workers globally are part-time or in some form of temporary employment, In addition, over 22% are self-employed, often under dire conditions. So chart 2 here shows the same labor data, but only with respect to the developed countries or the global north. So here we see that the proportion of wage workers is larger and the reserve army of labor is a bit smaller. However, it's clear that without counting part-time and contingent employment, the reserve army is still huge, constituting some 26% of the available workforce in 2015. Also, since precariousness is often associated with part-time and contingent work, and since the shift to these work situations is increasing in the advanced capitalist countries, its growth is much greater than the ILO data revealed here. So it's not necessarily that we have swaths of people who are doing no work at all or just completely unemployed. Often for people in the global south, this is not an option, so they will do whatever they can, work whatever informal job they can just to put food on their plates. But it's that work everywhere is becoming more and more precarious, and that capitalism produces this precariousness. It produces this reserve army of labor in order to keep accumulation going. And it's not just going to be poor sweatshop workers that we can just kind of keep out of sight, out of mind. It's going to be you and I. It's going to be our parents. It's going to be so many people. I mean, I've made another video about automation. So labor will have less and less and less bargaining power, and we'll have to just accept the scraps that are thrown to us in order to eat food. This is how capitalism functions in its innermost levels. So we can't just put a happy face on this or make some kind of compassionate capitalism. Like, try putting a happy face on this. We're gonna have to get ahead of what is coming for us in this system, and that means uniting, waking up, and starting to actually work on plausible alternatives. So thanks so much again to my patrons. I got a number of new pledges, which is wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Check me out on Facebook, Twitter, etc. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in another video.